Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is the causes of World War II recorded lecture. And so, World War II is such a big topic. We're going to break this up into several parts, and so it'll be more than three as usual. So, it's one of my favorite topics to teach on. It's usually one of students' favorite things to learn about as well. And so, we're going to talk about how the war begins in Europe, or the causes of it, and then also the war in Asia, because they're started for different reasons. And oftentimes you look at I'll talk about the difference between when World War II begins in Europe versus Asia, because actually World War II technically begins in Asia before it does in Europe. And so you got to understand what is the driving things that lead to the rise of these totalitarian regimes that take place. I'm sure all of you have heard of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, as these are oftentimes portrayed in movies, and students have heard about this just because of the nature of what happens during World War II and the horrific atrocities that committed as well. So what you have is you have a combination of problems after World War I, and then also the Great Depression that takes place. And so particularly if you look at Germany, Germany is humiliated after World War I. They had been propagandized to believe that they were winning the war the whole time, and so at the end, when they end up losing, the German people are surprised. And then also, what you have is the Treaty of Versailles was very oppressive towards the Germans. Now, historians have uncovered that if the Germans would have won, they would have implemented the same reparations on the British or the French too. So any of those nations would have done that had they had the opportunity to present itself. So, but the Great Depression, Germany kind of has two. They have one right after World War I, which was terrible. The inflation was so bad you could take a wheelbarrow full of paper currency and it still wouldn't buy a loaf of bread, because they had massively printed too much paper money in the early 1920s, and they had massive inflation. And so here Germany goes from before World War I being very economically strong, one of the top three industrial powerhouses in the world and such a powerful nation, to really being humiliated during the war, when they thought via propaganda they were winning the whole thing. And so then you have the Great Depression that emerges in 1929, and so Germany gets hit again. So their Wehrmacht government was kind of inept to handle this, and that's going to play into the hands of the Nazi Party, promising jobs and promising economic stability. And so they're able to seize power of the German Reichstag, which is the German Congress, and then the rise of Adolf Hitler as well as leader of the Nazi Party. Of course, we'll talk about the different reasons for Japan as well, but really the Great Depression and how they were treated after World War I was contributing factors to their expansion as well in the 1930s. So you look right here, Germany loses some territories. Particularly, they lose this one city right here is a free city called Danzig. It was like 90% German. And they lost that at the end of World War I, and that they wanted that important seaport to get access to the Baltic Sea. Okay, they also were not supposed to rearm. They couldn't put troops in the Rhineland. They lost Alsace-Lorraine to France, which Alsace-Lorraine is this area right here on the German-French border, and so forth. And so Prussia had won that when the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. So Germany's lost territory. There's new countries of Czechoslovakia that are formed. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire is broken up into smaller states and so forth. And you can see right here is that free city of Danzig, which is kind of like its own country. Poland is created from the lands that Germany and the Soviet Union, or what becomes the Soviet Union, is actually the Russian Empire during World War I, when Russia pulled out in 1917. And so you end up having these weak democracies that are also going to be taken advantage of by the mighty German Third Reich and so forth. So if you remember, in World War I, the United States does not join the League of Nations. The League of Nations is kind of inept and weak at this time. A lot of the most powerful countries, Britain and France, are kind of gun shy from World War I. They had lost so many men, spent so much money, and so forth, and they were fearful of having another conflict. And so the United States is not part of the League of Nations. Now, I want to show you this. Look at by November of 1923, what the value of the German mark, which is their dollar compared to the U.S. dollar. I mean, it was horrible inflation, some of the worst in world history. You also have the rise of what's called totalitarian dictators. Okay, these are governments run by a single individual, and they have their governments implement total power. And so there's going to be pretty much no freedoms in the society to speak out against the government. There's no freedom of the press, freedom of the speech. Also, these totalitarian dictators, particularly Hitler and Mussolini, are going to be very racist. You also have that with the Japanese imperial military government as well, is very racist towards the Chinese and other people of Asia. And also, you'll see that the Germans are going to be very discriminatory to certain groups, particularly the Jews, but also when they invade Eastern Europe, the Slavic speaking people, particularly the Polish and other Russians and so forth. Okay, one of the things that these totalitarian dictators are going to pride themselves on is having very large and oppressive militaries. Okay, the Nazi Third Reich had one of the most impressive militaries of the last 500 years. Italy's army wasn't as impressive, but they did have a very impressive navy in the Mediterranean. So let's talk about Italy first, because the first totalitarian dictator to seize power is actually Mussolini. Of course, Stalin was second when Lenin dies. But Mussolini had been a soldier for the Italians during World War I. The Italians felt like, because they were part of the alliance with Britain, France, and later the United States, and defeated Austria-Hungary, even though they didn't do very well on the Italian front, that they are due some land on the Austrian-Hungarian border. Well, Britain and France did not give them that land, and so the Italian prime minister actually leaves the Treaty of Versailles peace proceedings angry and upset. Mussolini ended up becoming a prominent journalist and put out a lot of kind of this fascist propaganda and so forth. And I'll explain what fascism is in just a minute. And he gained popularity. And so one of the things that he would do is he would organize these movements, or these rallies with these group of Italian young men called the Black Shirts. Okay, they would typically wear black shirts. Now, oftentimes Mussolini would not show up unless he knew that the government was not going to crack down. But these are kind of like Mussolini's thugs that were intimidate people, beat up people to gain power. Eventually, because of pressure from the Black Shirts, the King of Italy appointed Mussolini as prime minister in 1922. So he's actually the first of the totalitarian dictators to seize power. One of the things that Mussolini does is he promises to rebuild Italy. And so he begins building up the Italian military, particularly the Navy was what Italy was most known for. And later in the mid-1930s and 1935, Italy is going to invade one of the last two independent countries in Africa, because if you remember, during imperialism, the rest of Africa is carved up except for Ethiopia and Liberia. So Ethiopia had repelled the Italians in the late 1800s because they actually had quite a bit of firearms and so forth in the late 1800s and stopped imperialism from taking place. Also, Ethiopia was brilliant at playing off other European countries against each other. And Ethiopia was a predominantly Christian nation, so they also appealed to Europeans and said, hey, that we're a Christian nation as well. That does not stop Italy. Mussolini had told his people that he wanted to rebuild the Roman Empire. One thing you got to have, Mussolini, to rebuild the Roman Empire is a legit military, and the Roman Empire had one. His army is not going to do very well. But the reason why he's successful in Italy in 1935, or in Ethiopia in 1935, is because they had tanks and airplanes and so forth. The Ethiopians had firearms, but how are you supposed to stop an air force when you don't have one? And so the military technology were too much, and Ethiopia gets taken over in 1935 by Italy, and then Italy gets expelled from the League of Nations as a result of this. And so what exactly is fascism? It's a political system, okay, where it advertises and advocates for a dictatorship, but also it's got some similarities to communism because the state is going to control industry, okay, like in a communist country. One thing that's different, where communism is supposed to be all races are part of this overall communist society, doesn't mean that just because you were in a communist country doesn't mean there wasn't racial persecution. There still was. But in theory, communism is supposed to be all races are equal. With fascism, though, one key difference between that and communism is it advocates for racial superiority. So the Italians advocating that they are racially superior to other groups, particularly the Ethiopians. Also, they really kind of have like a cult following of the totalitarian leader. There's a lot of propaganda to make them out to be this great and mighty leader. They did a lot of parades of their military might to kind of show off, a lot of rallies, and they would film this and televise this and so forth to appeal. Well, there wasn't much TVs at this time, but they would do a lot of rallies in public, but also with radio to convince them of their superiority and so forth. Fascism also favors militarism and expansion, and also extreme nationalism. Now let's get to the Soviet Union. So Russia ends up having the Bolshevik Communist Revolution in 1917. There's a couple different groups that vie for power. Eventually, Russia erupts in a civil war versus the White Army and the Red Army. The Red Army, which is the communists and Bolsheviks, end up prevailing, and Vladimir Lenin seizes power. So one of the things is Lenin implemented communism right off the bat, and have state control of things and these collective farms. But what ends up happening is they end up having less farm output, and they're on the verge of economic collapse. And so what ends up happening is Lenin is forced to kind of lessen some of the farm collectives and so forth, and gives private property back to some farmers, so that way they have more incentive to farm again and farm effectively. And so this does lead to a little bit of economic gain at that time. Lenin ends up dying in 1924, and there was two members of the Communist Party within the Soviet Union that vied for power. One of them is Leon Trotsky, who was a famous general for the Red Army during the Civil War, that they prevailed against the White Army, and then Joseph Stalin. What ends up happening is that Joseph Stalin is kind of like the show Big Brother. He kind of forms all these secret alliances with other Communist Party leaders to gain power himself. Trotsky is forced to flee to Mexico. He does try to regain power via secret messages and so forth in the late 1920s. But then Stalin ends up having a spy assassin kill him in the late 1920s. This guy was his butler, and he kills him with an ice pick. So Stalin was able to seize power and is arguably one of the most evil people to ever live in world history. In fact, he ends up allowing his son to get captured in the war by the Germans, and the Germans offered for a ransom to release him, and he doesn't even care about it. He was a ruthless individual. They referred to him as the man of steel. And so Stalin is going to try to modernize Russia's both agriculture and industry. One of the things that he implements is he tries to go back to collective farming that Lenin tried. And so instead of having individual ownership of your farm, they seized private property from farmers, and then they put them on these collectives. And so everybody would farm together. Well, a lot of these farmers resisted this. Well, they end up getting tried or executed or sent to the gulags of Siberia, where they died working in these terrible camps in the harshness of Siberian winter. And so a lot of these were small farmers that own a little bit of land and so forth, and they were resistant. So what ends up happening, a lot of these farms aren't very productive, which is crazy considering the Soviet Union should have been the third largest grain producing country in the world had it been previously before World War I. And it actually one of the things too that Stalin wanted to do with what he called these 5-year plans is that the farmers were supposed to bear the brunt and produce all of this food for basically minimal cost and very little, if any, profit. They were barely, so a lot of times they didn't even break even to provide the food for the industrial workers. And so basically, you basically kind of rob from Peter to give to Paul. The farmers are getting robbed to give to the industrial workers. And it was devastating to farmers, and millions of people died from either getting oppressed by the government and sent to the gulags, or had these show trials, or they were starved to death. And you had one of the worst man-made famines that world history caused. And so what ends up happening is Russia is able to rapidly industrialize faster than any other